to kick us off and to introduce us to a whole new paradigm in thinking about not-for-profit governance as leadership. I'm happy to introduce Bill Ryan. If you haven't read his book, we tried to send it to all the directors of the Boston Foundation, and Amazon.com said they're out of print already. But Paul and Ray and I will send it to every member of the Boston Foundation board. I've read it. I think it should become a Bible, and he's going to quickly introduce us, and I don't want to steal any of his thunder about this new paradigm in thinking. Bill is a research fellow at the Hauser Center for the Study of Not-for-Profit Institutions and Their Governance at Harvard University. He's been a consultant to many not-for-profit institutions. He's a graduate of Columbia, and you'll forgive the expression, the Kennedy School of Government. And he's the author of a previous book about high-performing not-for-profit institutions. He focuses on so many challenges that face us: capital markets, competition, but the focus of his insights this morning, and I recommend them to you, is governance as leadership. Bill Ryan.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Ira. That's a very generous introduction, and I know I'm now in over my head when I'm about to lecture Ira Jackson on trusteeship, but if at nothing else, I'm becoming good at shamelessness. And let me thank also Geeta and the entire team here at the Boston Foundation for putting together such a well-conceived event. We'll see how it gets executed in the coming moments. I want to, before I jump into explaining this framework that you've been peeking at in your handouts, just take a minute to orient you about how we're going to get into it, where I'm coming from. Because I know most of you, when you're not busy governing and worrying about accountability these days, are going to conferences where you're worrying about governance and accountability. And you're hearing two types of talks. One is version A, where someone comes before you and informs you that the regulators are coming and that they're very, very, very angry at you, and that you've got a lot of catching up and cleaning up to do. We won't be doing that version in the first few minutes this morning. The other is when version B, a consultant comes before you and promises you that it really is, in fact, possible and easy with his help to fix all the problems of governance. And I'm not foolish enough to do that version. So we're going to do a version C, which is where I want to engage with you in thinking about some of the problems we face with governance and accountability, and respecting them by acknowledging them as baffling problems, as really difficult problems. That's why, in fact, we're so preoccupied. These are not easy things to solve. So I hope that we'll end this first kind of overview presentation with you feeling more stimulated, more willing to rethink some of the problems of governance differently, and at least in part better equipped to do so. And I'm going to do that, I hope, by presenting this framework, governance as leadership. And I'm going to try to get us there in three painless steps. I want to revisit first the problem we face with governance and spend a little bit of time trying to reframe that, since it obviously informs the solutions we attempt to execute. Then I want to walk us briefly through the framework, and then finally, third, spend some time on an aspect of governance that we feel is kind of emerging but has been too long overlooked, and really kind of drill down on that, what we call generative governance, in some depth. And we'll definitely have you out of here by 4:30 as promised. So let me go to the problem. What is the problem we're trying to solve as analysts, my colleague and I? What's the problem that you're facing in your work? And I want to suggest first kind of give a depiction of our take on the prevalent conception of the problem. And I think in the most prevalent conception, when you turn to the literature, talk to consultants, talk to your peers, is a diagnosis that says we have a problem of performance, and specifically a problem of performance rooted in ignorance. And essentially the problem being that boards don't understand their roles and responsibilities. And in fact, we have an entire industry and an entire literature based on educating boards about their roles and responsibilities. And the idea in this diagnosis is that because of ignorance, boards stray into all the other types of problems that we know they are prone to, dysfunctional group dynamics, inertia, apathy, etc. And so our response, naturally, to that version of the problem has been to codify the board's roles, to clarify everything. We like to think of what we have done, and we have contributed to this ourselves, but what the field has done is create an official job description for the nonprofit board as an institution. And the hope is that with enough training, codification, clarification, we'll kind of train ourselves out of this problem. We have some suspicions that could be a complete account of the problem on a few fronts. First, there are many boards, obviously, kind of highly informed boards that do understand their roles and responsibilities and that still face governance challenges and indeed face very frustrating challenges. Second, we are very suspicious about the whole approach to creating an official job description for the board, in the sense that if you think of organizational life, we tend to codify job tasks most tightly for the people at the bottom of the hierarchy in the organization, the people who are going to be granted the least discretion, whose judgment we trust least. And for the people at the top of the hierarchy, we say, just be a CEO. You know what we mean. And so we wonder why the board, nominally with the most power, should be the group most preoccupied with having a literal kind of tightly packaged official job description. So we want to propose an additional thread of diagnosis and introduce kind of a reframing here, and suggest that in addition to these problems, which we think are real, these problems of performance, boards also face a problem of purpose, what we have come to think of as micro-governing. And the problem as we see it is not that boards are necessarily, although some are, but not that boards are necessarily ignorant about their roles and responsibilities. It's that they don't find those roles and responsibilities consequential or meaningful to them personally. They don't find that they allow them to have important impact on their organizations or community. And that in tidying up, in fact, the official job description, we might have begun to actually shrink governance and lead boards into this territory of micro-governing, where they're focused on technical tasks more than on a broader conception of governance. And when we were trying to think of how this might work and what the consequences of this might be, we hit on the idea of saying, wow, this is a lot like the situation that the substitute teacher faces in a classroom in the following sense. Substitute teacher provides a vital function, the most important function in the school: control the classroom, keep order and safety. Substitute teachers, if any of you have been unfortunate enough to try it, find something else. The work is terrible. It's very difficult to control the classroom when that is all you're doing. It's actually more feasible to control a classroom while also teaching. And this might be something similar to what we're creating with boards. By insisting that boards focus only on control and order in their organizations and not dabble in anything else, not meddle in anything else, we might in fact have made that job more difficult to execute and ended up with this type of micro-governing. So for us, the challenge is, how do we expand our conception of governing? And we want to make the challenge even harder by asking not just what else could boards do that would keep them busy and satisfied and experiencing meaningful work, but what more could they do in governing specifically, not just as helpers and boosters and friends of the organizations, but what more as governors could they do? And it's here, to get some traction, that we ended up in our own thinking turning to a lot of theory developed in the past kind of 30 or 40 years on leadership, on management, on organizations, on social groups in general. And in the spirit of the holiday, I have, as a special gesture of goodwill, reduced it to one slide, which I'll now present. Because we before we get into governance as leadership, we have to ask ourselves, I think, what does governing have to do with nonprofit organizations? What kind of governing do modern organizations really demand of nonprofit boards? It helps, after all, if we think of it that way, because boards are governing organizations, and we tend to kind of lose sight of that. And so when we look at the literature and ask kind of how is our thinking about organizations and leadership emerged over the past several decades, we see a few propositions that are very prevalent and that I think most of us as practitioners can endorse and relate to. First is the idea that effective leaders and the theories that describe them see organizations as they really are, not necessarily as we wish they are. And that means that they're complex and they're multidimensional. We used to think of organizations more or less as machines. You take the money, the inputs, you have your work process all codified, clarified, you convert the resources into outputs, it has an impact somewhere. We're much more likely now in the past several decades to see organizations as also being cultures, place with kind of styles of doing things that has a powerful effect. As social networks, where kind of who you know has as much to do with what you're able to get done as what you know. Or as political systems, where kind of there's a lot of negotiation embedded in a lot of what people try to do. Or even, as some venture to say, organizational anarchies, where yes, we're all together on the same page in theory, but often experience it more like something out of Dilbert. But the basic idea is that organizations are complex. And a key feature of these complex organizations is that they're partly non-rational. And that, of course, is a real finding, because nobody thinks, except the people who went out to study this, nobody thinks that organizations are, in fact, the sum of kind of the organizational chart, the job descriptions, the work process, and the budget. Everyone recognizes that there are group dynamics, there's history, there are values, there's culture, there are aspirations, kind of driving and sometimes creating conflict in organizations. It's not all about the charts and the manuals. So looking at that as a backdrop, come back to boards. How do we conceive of boards? And in the sake of brevity, I'll grossly overgeneralize here to suggest that that as we've conceived of the board as an institution, it's as if organizations were not at all like this. It's as if they were simple. It's as if they were rational. It's as if they were amenable to task and structure, where the job of a board is to figure out, okay, tell me again what my roles are. Okay, let's get the right committee structure. We should be able to handle that. A board that is premised on those views of a flat organization without all of these complexities and nuances is not prepared to govern that organization, any more than a CEO who came in with great budgetary skills or even great programmatic skills would be equipped to lead that organization. Like leadership, governance involves working across all the dimensions of an organization, not working on the organization as we wish it existed. And so that's what gets us to this concept that I want to spend a minute on of governance as leadership, with two key ideas. One, leaders and boards, we believe, need to work in multiple modes. Not just technical modes. They need to have at their disposal multiple ways of approaching the tasks that they face. And that includes being, for instance, sometimes a diplomat, a cheerleader, a booster, but it also might mean being a disciplinarian. And the mark of a good leader in much of the literature is what some have called cognitive complexity, the ability to take an ambiguous situation, and that's what organizations constantly throw at us, take that ambiguous situation, look at it from many different perspectives, and choose a mode that will enable you to be effective. So it used to be that the leader was thought of as the person who got the right answer first and could get others to follow. It's now more often thought, and I think many of us would endorse this, that the leader is the person who can size up that ambiguous situation, help everyone else figure out what it really means, and then mobilize the group to tackle the challenge. So we want to kind of look at governance then in light of that. If organizations require multiple modes, and if leaders have mastered the art of kind of effective leaders of operating in multiple modes, what does it say for trusteeship? I'll give you a moment to admire this graphic feat. If you ever imagine a three-part concept depicted as a triangle, that's what we're venturing to do. The image starts to answer a question much more important than our graphics would suggest, and that is this question. So if organizations are complex, as I'm suggesting, how should boards govern? What modes do they need? And I want to just walk quickly around the triangle, pointing out the modes, and then we're going to drill down on one of them. The bottom, type 1, fiduciary governance. This is what we are spending so much time on today, encouraged and threatened by the United States Congress and regulators around the country. We're really all focused on what does it take for a board to ensure that its resources are used in service of the mission, that the mission doesn't drift or slip, that nothing gets wasted or stolen or misappropriated. Critically important, that's why it's kind of the foundational line here in the triangle. I'm not going to be drilling into this today because I think we could spend a day on it, and I want to be focusing us on this big picture of the triangle and working a little bit on uncovered territory. The only thing I want to observe here about this is that this fiduciary role of the board or mode of the board really focuses the board on one aspect of the organization, and that's the productive organization. This is the part of the organization where you're worried about converting resources into outputs, and it makes sense to track, as if it were a factory, in fact, that flow of resources into outputs, to look for errors, to make sure there's fidelity to mission. Second mode for boards would be cleverly named Type 2, the strategic mode. And again, this is something we've been kind of increasingly familiar with, particularly in the last 15 or so years. Boards are kind of increasingly involved, if not developing strategy, overseeing the development of strategy. And so the rise of strategic planning in the boardroom, strategy retreats, is now pretty much complete, and most boards accept that they have a role here. Again, we're not going to kind of walk into a how-to session on this. It is complicated enough in its own right. I want to just emphasize here that when we're governing in the strategic mode, we're really working on what you might think of as the logical organization. This is where you're trying to figure out how, if we want to get from point A to point B, should we chart a course? What's the best path? Involves a lot of trade-offs, options analysis, and the like, whether you do them formally or informally. Third would be what we want to propose adding or making explicit, because it is present in many boards episodically, and that's this idea of generative governance, which I'll define in a moment at stupefying length and detail. But I want to point out here that what we're doing in a generative mode in an organization is governing what you might think of as the expressive organization. And this is the part of the organization where values and aspirations, where moral commitments not only take shape, but really drive everything else we do. And so we want to be suggesting that if we can figure out how to govern generatively, we can have a much greater impact on all the other work we do in organizations. So that's the thumbnail sketch of governance as leadership. The idea first of working in modes, because organizations are multifaceted. The idea second of being able to kind of move appropriately from mode to mode. And particularly I want to suggest now getting the hang of this third type of governance. So if you keep that image in mind, I want to move on and talk for a few minutes about generative governing. And I actually want to start with a more generic concept of generative thinking, and then we'll figure out how to convert that to governing. And I'll start in a very straightforward way. Let me offer a definition of generative thinking as a cognitive process for deciding what to pay attention to, what it means, and what to do about it. And just leave that there as a self-evident proposition, and then work through kind of where we see this in our lives. And I want to start not with an organizational case, but with a much more accessible idea of where we see generative thinking, and that's the idea of paradigm shifts that has been in much circulation for the past 20 or so years. And with paradigm shifts, which happen at kind of the field level rather than the organizational level, we see really the power of generative thinking. And to take one classic example, if you think about child abuse, something that some of you may be involved in combating or preventing, here's a case of generative thinking in action. Through the 40s and 50s into the early 60s, there was a large literature on childhood injury that suggested its prevalence, its severity, the scope, the type, the character of injuries children suffered, and there were many people in many professions working on it. All of them used generative thinking, a process of generative thinking, to determine what it was that childhood injury was all about. And the prevalent consensus was that it was all about accidents. And the power of generative thinking is not just in framing things like that, but in driving everything we do in response to that framing. So framed as accidents, everyone gets very busy working on playground safety, child-proofing the household, educating parents who might be disciplining their children physically and occasionally getting carried away out of ignorance. Really consequential, in fact, this matter of how we see things, what paradigm we operate in. A shift happened along the way where people looked up and said, what if it's not injury? What if this is actually intentional? What if we're dealing with abuse? Why is that important? It's important, as we know now, because it led to enormously different strategies. Less concern about childhood accidents, more concern about educating, prosecuting, detecting abuse. A totally different infrastructure was built. New strategies, new plans, totally new research agenda created that's kind of in our face if we work with children all the time now. So if you think about that type, the power of that type of thinking, and then come down to an organizational level, I want to suggest that the same process is at work in organizations. And we tend in organizations to look at a cluster of kind of privileged processes that we think are really powerful, mission setting, strategic planning, creating programs or program design, evaluation even. And we want to be suggesting that preceding all of those processes and really driving them is a process of generative thinking. That missions don't come out of nowhere. Missions come out of moral commitments. So by what process does an organization come up with a moral commitment? Strategies don't come out of nowhere. In order to have a goal that represents point B that we're working toward, we have to have a sense of what the future ought to look like. That doesn't happen necessarily in strategic planning. It happens before it. Well, how does that powerful work happen? That's what we want to be asking. In commercial organizations, a corollary here would be product development, where for many years people were worried about the challenge of getting an idea from the drawing board into the marketplace. And then more recently have started to say, well, wait, how do we get good ideas onto the drawing board in the first place? The same goes in science. I mean, we've got our scientific method down pat. We have whole research infrastructures built around it. But the scientific method doesn't tell a researcher where to get a good idea, how to generate a hypothesis. And of course, that's the most important part of scientific inquiry. So in organizations of all types, across all of these dimensions, this stuff doesn't come out of thin air. It's not like spontaneous generation, where you take the kind of the 17th century jar of rags and wheat husks and it sprouts flies. That's a very kind of unflattering image for what we do in organizations. But we want to be suggesting that all of these things, mission, strategy, programs, the problems we work on, all come out of this process of generative thinking. And the implication for us is that if that is so, that process, if made explicit, would be governance. I mean, the bedrock of governance is to set the organization's directions, to be a purpose setter, and then secondarily to hold it accountable. Well, if we don't understand the generative thinking where purpose setting and direction setting starts, we're not fully governing. Let's take a look at a closer look at what the challenge might be if we took generative thinking and converted it to generative governance. Where does it happen? And we're suggesting in this slide that the opportunity for generative work happens high on this curve. And high on this curve in organizational life is where things are just kind of looming as threatening problems that we don't have a handle on. They're nagging, something's wrong, we don't quite know what's right. If we're like me, we ignore it for a long time. Something's intriguing, there's a possibility emerging, we don't quite know what it represents. Right there at the top, under those conditions, is where the most opportunity lies to shape the direction setting of an organization. That's where everything gets framed. As we come down that curve, what we do is keep clarifying and keep converting all of that looming, nagging, intriguing stuff into the plans and strategies, the technical solutions that we need to make organizations work. The implication's pretty clear that if you want to be influential in direction setting, you need to be at the top of the curve. Again, if you go back to the paradigm example, at the top of the curve is all this data floating around about childhood injury, and the power to frame it as either accidents or abuse. In organizational life, you could supply your own examples. You might see downstream, for instance, at the bottom of the curve, a board working on something like, should our independent school build a state-of-the-art fitness center? Upstream would be a very different set of questions, which would be, why are we in an arms race for amenities for students? Is that consistent with our values? What do we really make of it? Do we want to frame this challenge in those terms? Do we want to compete or not? So all the time in organizational life, we're trying to operate downstream without necessarily acknowledging that we've done a lot of the most important work at the top of this curve, and that that's where the opportunity is. The bad news for boards, or the generative dilemma, is that they're often positioned to influence this least. So there you have an image of that generative curve, opportunities declining as you go along. The second curve pointing up shows what we are characterizing as typical board involvement. The board gets involved exactly when things have been already framed elsewhere, inside or outside the organization. The board gets involved not when things are looming or nagging or intriguing, but when things have already been settled enough to appear before them in a PowerPoint, on the agenda, in a spiral-bound report, with a facilitator all programmed at the retreat, the board is often coming in after the powerful opportunity to shape organizational purposes has passed. And that's what we're suggesting that we want to correct. Let's talk about what that might look like and entail, because it entails essentially inventing some new approaches to governing. And do that by looking at where this happens in organizations. Where does generative thinking happen? Now, I already showed you, if you think of that curve, what we're doing low on the curve, where boards spend a lot of their time and where management should be focused, is working with a set of familiar processes. That's where we make policies and strategies and solve our problems. The good news about that is that we need to do that. It's our job to do that. And we have practices and processes that we're somewhat comfortable with that enable us to do it. Things like SWOT in strategic planning, assessing strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, needs assessments more generally of our environment, cost-benefit analysis. Even when we're not sure what it is we're trying to do, we have a way of thinking about that process called trial and error or muddling through. We're always somewhat aware of what it is we're doing kind of low on the curve, and we're always clear about its importance because in turn we know it leads to the payoff of implementation. We take those familiar processes, work them with those practices, and hand them off to management, turn them into service delivery, follow them through with evaluation. What we're suggesting is that this preceding process, this box here of generative thinking, needs to be fleshed out. Right now it's a black box. We know what comes out of it. All the most important things in the organization come out. We're not very clear on what goes on inside it. And that's what we have attempted to make a stab at clarifying. And I'll introduce just a little bit of jargon to help us along with this. And you'll find yourself haunted by these when you return to real life and try to explain to someone why they're engaged in something like sense-making. But to work through these little pieces of jargon, let me suggest that kind of again, instead of doing the work we do low on the curve, of where we produce policies and strategies and plans, high on the curve we're producing something else, a different type of cognitive product. And that cognitive product is sense. And when the sense we make in an organization is not the same as information, it's not data, it's not knowledge. It's a sense of what the information, the data, and the knowledge we have means, and therefore what to do about it. Now, so how does that happen and unfold? It happens through, this is really a matter of kind of in daily life, this is like perceptual psychology. I'm bombarded by so much stimuli. How do I know where to focus my eyes and process it? Same thing organizationally. We look around our organization, which is flinging at us all kinds of facts, data, people, episodes, events, problems, and we decide to focus only on some of them. Some of the cues and clues in that environment catch our attention. The people who have the power to decide what to pay attention to exercise enormous influence in their organizations because they say, stop, we're going to look at this, we're going to worry about this. What do they do with those bits and pieces, those cues and clues? They then engage in kind of a framing process to make sense of it. They look at them in a certain way, and that certain way of looking helps them figure out what to do. so they can look at those cues and clues, for instance, as a manager who's going to be worried about results and work processes. And we do this in meetings all the time. We say to a colleague, she's a social worker. That's why she's having this reaction to the dysfunctional group meeting, because that person might be framing things through a professional paradigm of social work. On and on it goes. We frame things with resort to values. If we're concerned with equity, we show up at a meeting and we're worried about diversity, inclusion, power distribution. It can even be temperamental. We can show up, see clues and clues, and say, oh my God, I'm going back to bed, it's too depressing. Or we can be those people who have another cup of coffee and tackle everything. This is, as you know, although presented in jargon, real life, what really drives things. And the question we're posing is, how do we formalize it so boards can do it? What does the challenge of formalizing look like? And I'll just add kind of one more example here to suggest the stakes of this, because I happen to be reading, and with this on the brain, as it were, the 9/11 Commission report. And one of the central findings in that report is a critique of our intelligence system for a failure of imagination. Now, of course, if they had read an early draft of our book, they would have said failure of generative thinking, because they mean the same thing. And what they mean is, look, we have this huge amount of infrastructure, all these resources out there whose job it is to focus on certain cues and clues and decide which ones to pay attention to and to make sense of it. And what we got was kind of bad framing, bad sense-making. We got a lot of people who saw little bits and pieces, aircraft, terrorists, that could be trouble. But they framed it in different ways. Some of them were using a Cold War rivalry frame that said we don't have to worry about that, we've got metal detectors. Some of them were using a terrorist frame, but a rogue state thing. Well, we're kind of on top of states and aircraft production and use. We won't let this happen. And the challenge that the 9/11 Commission has put to the U.S. government is, as they put it in their very own words, to institutionalize imagination. It sounds kind of like an oxymoron. They even went so far as to say what I would never advise nonprofits to do, which is to bureaucratize imagination. But it's the same challenge. What they want is a better quality of thinking, not just better plans and execution. We're not digging into this box. This is for the one-day workshop, the new practices that are needed in order to kind of convert this into board process. And I would just suggest that, to give you a flavor of them, one of the things we would say in light of this for generative work is that the board, as we now conceive it and operate it, probably couldn't be more hostile to generative thinking. It's a wonder anyone is able to do generative thinking under the conditions of a normal boardroom, where you get together, isolated from your environment. You don't let any stray cues or clues in. That's off message, off agenda. Everything needs to be spiral bound in black and white. And so you're deprived of all the opportunity to make sense of your own environment. Thinking retrospectively, we would be suggesting boards should be focused much more on the past, not just to look for errors that might have taken place in management, but to find new patterns that might suggest new innovations or new strategies or new problems, kind of reassembling cues and clues from the past in new ways. Both of those and many of the other things we suggest involve a new type of deliberation. Robert's Rules of Order will not get you into generative thinking. It needs to be much more like what boards do in a strategic retreat. And boards often find strategy retreats the high point of their work. And so our design question is, can we make more board meetings more like strategic retreats instead of doing that once every year or every 3 years? I'll just leave all of that dangling, and in conclusion, the words you've been waiting for, offer one last image that describes kind of where generative thinking now happens in our environments. Because again, our suggestion is not that no one's doing it. It's that boards are not often enough involved and equipped to do it so they can govern fully. And if you just look quickly at these scenarios, we're showing here kind of 4 pictures of who does generative thinking and therefore what type of governance it creates. And we're presenting it in terms of how involved is the staff in doing this thinking and how involved are the trustees. And so if you start with the kind of the lower left here, you have what we're calling governance by default, because neither the staff nor the trustees are explicitly involved in saying, hey, wait a minute, how did we frame this? How did we make sense of this? What cues did we really focus on? Is this really us? before they embark on strategy or planning or program design. They're letting others do it. Often they're letting funders do it. They're letting kind of professional networks do it for them. They're accrediting agencies and the like. They're letting policy kind of from the government do it, and they're passive in the face of it. You knew that would be a bad story in the low quadrant. If you move to the upper left there, you have an attempt to correct it that we think is really dysfunctional. That's where trustees will do all of the generative thinking and kind of keep staff out of it. Something you could think of as governance by fiat, which is not going to make executives happy, and it's not going to even take full advantage of what staff offer. So we would tend to rule it out, although some of you may have to suffer through that or do already. If you go to the lower right, this is, I think, what we have in many organizations, which is leadership as governance. This is where staff, the CEO, the executive director, does all of the framing, and the board is along for the ride, maybe trying to catch up occasionally. Again, our proposition is that leaders need to be doing this work. It really is part of leadership, but it's also part of governance. And so we've got to get people into that high quadrant there in the upper right, which is where we would see kind of the best display of Type 3 governance. That's where boards and staff are doing this work together. And it doesn't always mean that boards are coming up with generative propositions, but it definitely always means that boards are empowered to help their staff do generative thinking and to critique it as it takes place. Just as boards don't necessarily have to design a budget in fiduciary work, but they do have to review it. Just as boards don't necessarily have to single-handedly create a strategy, but they do have to review it. The same would be true of generative governance. Boards could participate hands-on in developing generative propositions, or at the very least we would say they would engage with staff to say, well, how did you get here? And what values and what lenses, what frameworks came into play. So our proposition is we need to get there, and then finally, while standing there, we need to remember that triangle and govern in these two other essential modes that focuses on strategy. Once we've framed something, how do we execute it? And fiduciary work. Once we're executing, how do we ensure we're doing it with integrity? That's the drive-by version of governance by leadership, and I think that concludes the abstract, irrelevant part of the program, and that we will now switch to real-life leaders and governors, and I'll be listening attentively because you all know, as I do, that they will be appearing in my next book, and where I will take credit for their accomplishments and ideas. So thank you for your patience. Look forward to our dialogue when we get the...
Just terrific, Bill. Thank you so much. Read the book. Get the book. It's a thin book and very accessible and inspirational. I've had our fifth Boston Foundation board member who is here today is going to lead us in the panel conversation. Benny Wiley, I've had the privilege of knowing for many years and is a friend. She's also been the expressive, expressive leadership leader of a remarkable institution which 13 years ago was in crisis, needed strong fiduciary governance, went through a process of strategic repositioning, and has been making a huge leadership difference in this town ever since. For those of you who are not familiar with the partnership, which Benny has been leading as president and CEO for more than a dozen years, it's a very creative and innovative NGO unique to Boston. I spent some time in Atlanta, which is considered a black mecca, and they are benchmarking the partnership for best practice in this regard. It's a mechanism through which and by which this town becomes more hospitable, more engaging to professionals of color, develops their leadership potential, and assists them in networking and making a difference in this town. If we think back historically to where Boston was in the 80s and 90s, coming out of busing, and how hostile it was perceived to African Americans of color graduating from the Harvard Business School and medical schools and whatnot. Today, 1,350 fellows have gone through Benny's program, African American professionals in this town. 85% of them have stayed contributing to Boston's greatness and goodness. Benny Wiley.
Thank you. Ira didn't mention that he also served on the board of directors of the partnership and led one of our strategic plans. So that's why we looked at each other and smiled when Bill was sharing that aspect of his presentation. I think Bill did a brilliant job of framing the scope and the breadth of the responsibilities that exist and could potentially exist for those of us who serve as directors of nonprofit organizations. And he really touched on kind of the kind of dimensions of our responsibility. And as he and Ira talked about, our organizations are becoming more complex. And therefore, our responsibilities as board members are becoming more complex, and the level of accountability is becoming heightened. And we kind of talked briefly about the fiduciary responsibility and the strategic role, but by coincidence, I moderated a panel yesterday at which the Associate Attorney General and the Chief of the Division of Public Charity spoke. And it's important as we kind of talk about each of these dimensions of fiduciary and strategic and generative that we realize we're operating in an environment where we're under much more intense scrutiny, and which makes it even more complex. And one of the biggest takeaway I had from the forum yesterday is that the legislative impact and influence upon us as directors of nonprofits is that they're expecting us to be much more knowledgeable about the operations and the finances of the institutions of which we are having this public trust. And that's everybody that's on it. And part of what he talked about is that, yes, you want to have a diverse board, but everybody needs to understand the operations and the finances. So if you think about these dimensions and you think about the importance of understanding the fiduciary role that we play, clearly the strategic role, but the third, in the way I describe it, which clearly is a little different than Bill, is that the board also serves as a brain trust. That's really how I think of certainly the directors of the partnership, and that brain trust is to make sure that we're not only fulfilling our mission, but we're maximizing our potential and how that mission is defined and how we achieve that mission, particularly in context of where we are as an organization in our stage of evolution at that particular point in time, and in context of the environment in which we are operating. And I think those are really important attributes to think about as we engage in the discussion with this morning's panelists, because they're going to share with us where they were at a particular point in time and how they responded as an institution through management and an institution through the board. We're going to hear from a large cultural organization, and we're going to hear from a relatively small community-based organization, and they're going to share with us a case study. And by definition, a case study is looking at an issue at a particular point in time and how that organization responded to it. And as we listen to them, we want to think about all of what Bill talked about in the different dimensions that we were responsible for as directors. So I'm going to ask the panelists to come up, and as they do, I'm just going to briefly tell you who they are, and you have their bios in your materials. We're going to first hear from the New England Aquarium, and coming on the stage now is Ed Toomey, who is the president and the CEO of the aquarium, has been since October of 2001, and that's also an important day because that's 1 month after 9/11. And he served as the CEO there and has a wealth of experience as an administrator and in civic community of Boston. With Ed Toomey is Mary Reiner, who is the chair of the Board of Overseers of the New England Aquarium and has been involved with the aquarium for since 1991. They're obviously our large cultural institution. The other case study that we're going to learn from is Bird Street Community Center, and we have with us Mariel Gonzalez, who is the executive director of Bird Street, and she has not only been a leader in that organization, but has brought a wealth of fundraising experience to that role. And her chair, Katie Carrington, who's been in that role just since 2003 and been on the board just since 2000. Each organization is going to present to us for approximately 10 minutes, helping us understand their mission, helping us understand the challenge or the circumstances that they found themselves in at the point in time of the case study, and then share with us how they resolved it. Then I'm going to ask them a couple of questions, but more importantly, we're going to open it up to you to engage with them, particularly in context of the discussion that was just presented to us by Bill Ryan. So I'm going to turn it over to Ed.
Thank you, Benny.
I will.
Is that on? Can you hear? So it is not on.
It is on.
Is it?
Just bring it a little closer.
Okay. Now can you hear? There doesn't appear to be. I can speak louder if we're...
I think we just pulled them just close so they don't.
Now can you hear? Okay. I was listening to Bill Ryan speak, and on at several points I wanted somebody say amen. That he says that we're going to be in his next book. I'm speaking for myself and the New England Aquarium. I think I was in his last book. So I want to make a couple of preliminary remarks. I think the topic that we're discussing, and I think Bill referenced this in a number of ways, is just beginning. And so we're just beginning. It's almost like developing a course. We're beginning to develop the vocabulary. We're beginning to write the syllabus. We're beginning to do the book list. We're beginning to develop the pedagogy. What is the problem? Who's going to talk about it? How are we going to talk about it? What resources and references will we use? So as you're sitting here today listening to a case statement, especially when we get to the point about talking about generative governance, this is an issue that's brand new in many senses, and you're learning with us as we go along. The second issue is this, that it's very, very difficult to tell the New England Aquarium story in about 5 minutes. And because I want to leave the other 5 minutes to my colleague from governance. And so I'll go through rapidly what I think the issues were and then leave more time for questions. And then the third thing is this. I want to tell you, lest I forget it and get wound up in talking about some of the other issues, where I want to end up. So I want to tell you that at the beginning. I do not think it is possible to talk about governance and equate governance simply with the notion of board. No more than you could in not-for-profit institutions. No more than you could talk about public governance, those who elect public office, and not talk about the electorate. Or no more than you could talk about for-profit institutions and not talk about shareholders. And so when you're talking about governance, its actuality and changes, even in the not-for-profit sector. There are appropriate conversations about the board itself, but they entail essential references to the staff, to the management, and to those who support and use those institutions wherever they're found. So let me tell you what the issue was. The issue for the New England Aquarium as its problem was to maintain the integrity of its mission being to present and protect the world of water in the face of critical financial challenges. And I'm going to be absolutely frank with you in terms of what those challenges were. There's a bit of history to this. It starts in the year 2000. Many people think, and Benny just referenced it, and it is a factor, that most of our problems, if not all of them, were an effect of what happened on September 11th. And I want to tell you straight out that that was not the case. That our story begins in the year 2000, when I came aboard as the Chief Operating Officer of the New England Aquarium. And to fulfill my pledge to be absolutely frank with you, The problem presented itself to me. It got very complex as we went along, but the problem presented itself to me in November of 2000. I came aboard as Chief Operating Officer in July of 2000 simply because the New England Aquarium could not pay its bills. That was the direct issue that faced me, and I had to determine why that was the case. In an article referenced in your case study, Mary Noble refers to what happened at the New England Aquarium as the perfect storm. Indeed, that was the case. But it was not just September 11th. So I began to identify some financial issues that perhaps simply could have been faced and solved in a short period of time, but they were there. So there were issues prior to September 11th. There was the fact of September 11th itself and what it did to an institution such as mine with respect to its attendance, with respect to its events business, which is a very serious part of what we do. We lost 100% of our events business after September 11th. We lost 60% of our attendance at the gate. And so the September 11th was an issue. At the same time, because of the financial issues that we were facing, I had to face whether or not to continue with certain capital projects we were engaged in. And I want to point out to you that I did that as the Chief Operating Officer, not as the President. It was after I faced those issues as the Chief Operating Officer and then made some decisions about them that I became the President. And it's one of the issues affecting governance. We had a major expansion called the East Wing, which would have more than doubled the exhibit space of the New England Aquarium on the table at $130 million. As Chief Operating Officer, I led the decision-making process to take that off of the table. And when I did that, I'll say to you now in reflection, I had too much authority, and there was not as much participation by governance as should have been. And so that was really an issue. Because it wasn't working, management had more authority than it really should have had. At the same time, what was happening on the Big Dig affected attendance of the New England Aquarium, what was happening in the industry itself with respect to attendance at cultural institutions, what was happening with the war and what was happening with SARS also affected what was happening at the New England Aquarium. As we faced those issues in 2000 and 2001, we had a Board of Governors, a Board of Trustees of 125 members. And so numbers was an issue. That we had to face that issue, and we had to attempt to make decisions in the context of that number. The real issue, and as I say, it takes a long time to talk about these, but the real issue when management is dealing with that number of trustees is that it tends to manage information, to reduce information to least common denominator, and not really to engage an appropriate number by giving and engaging people in the right kind of information. So that's what was happening. That was the perfect storm. It was exacerbated by September 11th. When we took our major capital programs off the table, we immediately, and we knew we were doing it, we immediately threw every one of our banking covenants into default. It was our decision. We did that with the bank. We understood there were consequences, and we would live with the consequences. So that was our problem. Yet, at that point of the game, we did not know the real root of the problem. So as we came out of 2001 and went into 2002, we went into another stage of analysis at the New England Aquarium. And we identified, at the same time, by the way, we began the process of changing our Board of Trustees. We identified four major problems. They were these: that the level of debt of the New England Aquarium was too high for it to service. Debt in itself is not a problem, but you have to be able to service it. Our debt was $30 million. The amount necessary to meet our deferred maintenance requirements, some of those caused by removing the East Wing as a capital project, that would have been solved by that. The East Wing went away, the capital needs did not go away. But the challenge in maintenance and deferred maintenance was $35 million. Our endowment of effectively $30 million had gone to practically zero in terms of its effect on the budget. A good deal of that lost in the market, but a good deal of that used to support some of our own capital projects. And we had the question of accounts payable. If you add all of that up, the New England Aquarium had a challenge of $100 million. So that was the fiscal problem. And the issue was, how do you maintain your mission while you continue to face that? We did that in two ways. The first, at the same time as we were facing the financial issues, and I'll come back to that in my last statement because that's really the major issue, we began to work on a strategic plan for the New England Aquarium. So we met the energies of our staff, of our management, and a newly constituted Board of Trustees in that time frame. In 2001 and 2002, we moved from 125 trustees to 25 with unanimous support from the Board of Trustees. We developed a new case statement which focused the energies and the successes of the New England Aquarium. At the same time, we entered into formal restructuring. And I indicated to every member of the board, every manager, and every one of our constituents that every issue concerning the New England Aquarium was on the table, including every exhibit, including every expansion plan, including every job, including my own. And we engaged with the help of a local foundation which funded this restructuring process, a professional firm, the Recovery Group, who recommended to us 145 steps to take at the New England Aquarium, and we took 144 of them. And we implemented those. We did it and accomplished that about a year before. At the same time as we were doing that, as I said, we had in place the case statement emphasizing what the New England Aquarium would be as a force for lasting change, as a gateway on the harbor of Boston, and as a place to discover the world of water. There were lessons that were learned from all of these processes, from what we went through in 2001, from the strategic time we spent analyzing our problems in 2002, from the tactical decisions in 2003 to go through restructuring. And I just want to list those 7 lessons and then give it to Mary to talk about governance. The lessons are these. The primary lesson we learned is that the fundamental issue in the life of any organic institution is its governance. How many trustees you have, what the partnership relationship of those trustees will be to the people who are managing, visiting, and supporting the institution, and their views, the views of those people, those governors, concerning the cultural reality and quality of life in our community. So governance became the issue. Anything we did in restructuring, anything we did in strategic planning could not have the future it needed without a more vibrant governance. Governance drives it all. The second issue, the lesson that we learned, is that our institution and many institutions like ours did not manage its assets, both tangible and intangible. By tangible assets, I mean its investments, its real estate, anything that shows up on a balance sheet. By intangible assets, I mean its staff, its reputation. So the management of assets must be an agenda item for any institution. The third lesson is, by and large, governing boards, members of management of not-for-cultural institutions, do not understand the economics of not-for-profit institutions, a topic which could take a whole day of discussion, and much too long for this, but it is a reality. The fourth lesson is this: institutions must focus. They cannot be all things to all people, and that was a primary sin of the New England Aquarium. The fifth lesson is this: if you restructure, if you govern correctly, if you understand the economics of not-for-profits, still, you're not going to be able to get it done in the world in we live without effective partnerships with other institutions, and not just programmatic cooperations, but effective partnerships that reach into management and governance. The sixth lesson is this: that strategic communications must be the lifeblood of any not-for-profit institution, of any institution. You have to understand any message about your institution affects every other message about your institution. So it's almost like being a constitutional lawyer. Anything you read, you have to read in light of the next sentence. And the final lesson is this. The lesson is transparency. Everybody talks about transparency. I talk about aggressive truth-telling. I talk about getting out there before the story and telling people what it is. I will tell you that in this process, one of our greatest partners performing their civic responsibility was the media. Our story was told. It was told by the Boston Globe. It was told by the Boston Business Journal. They came, they asked the right questions, they reported them adequately, and that very story, with their doing their job as media representatives, helped us to do our job. So no one should fear that. That telling the story aggressively and truthfully is what you must do. And then it brings us back then to governance. You pull all of this together. And governance now as a partnership between those who govern and the governed, wherever that may be, governance then is not a way out of these problems. This kind of governance, I fully support what Bill's talking about in terms of generative governance. Governance is a way into your future. This kind of organic, alive, dynamic governance where people understand the complexity of the institutions and understand, by the way, that today's solutions may not be next year's solutions, but know there's give and play in terms of that. That kind of governance is what makes our institutions vital. I'll let Mary talk about what we did in particular to get all of that done. And I apologize again for going through that rapidly. I give a talk on this that takes about an hour and a half to do. So I'm sorry if I...
Well done. There'll be time for questions, too. Mary?
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Ed. Can everyone hear me? I'd like to begin by thanking the Boston Foundation for inviting us here today. It really is an honor to participate in the very good work that you are doing. I also thank all of you for coming out on this brisk morning. I'm originally from Chicago, so I feel quite at home with this with these chilly temperatures. As I was reading through our case statement that all of you have in your packet, I thought to myself, I'm certainly glad that I wasn't asked to come here 2 years ago. This would have been very tough for me to do. I come here this morning with Ed, my friend and colleague, and we both have smiles on our faces because we feel very good about the work that we have been able to accomplish in what I would say is a very short amount of time given the enormity of our problems. I would also say I wish that I'd had the benefit of Bill's wonderful book several years ago, but hindsight is always a wonderful thing, and I do look forward to using it in our governance going forward. What I'd like to do in just talking about how we've handled our governance over the last several years is just sort of take you through the 3 years, beginning in the year 2002, when I would say we realized that we were really in hot water. I vividly remember sitting in a conference room at Central Wharf when we first learned that the New England Aquarium, our beloved institution, was in serious financial trouble. Ed alluded to the fact that management was already keen to this for the previous year to 18 months. And I think that trustees had suspicion, but it was really, I know for me personally, early in 2002, that I sat in that room and I thought to myself, I have been a trustee of this institution since 1994. I have never missed a meeting. I have listened attentively. I have tried to ask questions when I didn't understand something. How could we possibly be in this situation? I also think we learned around that same time of our loss of accreditation by the AZA. That was a very tough blow for this institution. It's interesting, however, with some more experience with this situation, I think many of the trustees and overseers now look at that loss of accreditation as perhaps one of the best things that ever happened to us, because that governing body is really put in place to make sure that institutions stay fiscally sound. So it really brought clarity, and it focused us on the very serious issue at hand. The mood in that room at Central Wharf, I am happy to say, really changed very quickly, because we all looked at one another and we said, we need to understand what's happened in the past. We need to thoroughly dissect how we've gotten here. But more importantly, we need to look to the future and figure out how we can solve these problems. I don't think we could have done it if it weren't for several factors. We had Ed Toomey, who gave us great confidence as our CEO. He had already been in the role as Chief Operating Officer, and he moved into the role as CEO in a very honest, forthright, very straightforward manner. We all had confidence that the issues were on the table. We also had tremendous faith in our management team. And I can't tell you how reassuring that was for the trustees as we were all reconsidering our roles and how we had gotten in the situation we were in. The other two, I think, shared perspectives from all of the trustees was the fact that we all believed so deeply in the New England Aquarium as one of Boston's finest cultural institutions. We could not let it down. And lastly, and I would say this is what has really driven me to remain passionate about this institution. I've had my moments. I, along with my fellow trustees and overseers, really believe in our mission to present, promote, and protect the world of water. As far as I'm concerned, it's one of the greatest issues that our world faces. So that has motivated me throughout. The easiest thing when we learned in 2002 the situation we were in would have been to walk to the door. And I think that there were some people who were tempted to do so. I'm very happy to say we had 125 individuals in our governance structure. We lost very few people. And I think that that has been very important during this restructuring process. We all believed deeply. 2002 was clearly the year we were put to the test. We spent most of our time hearing from management, framing the issues for us so that we could better understand what kinds of solutions we needed to work towards. Our committee structure during that time was very loose because we were looking to the restructuring. We were beginning to cut positions at the aquarium. We didn't have the same kind of infrastructure. It was sometimes harder to get through to someone at the institution to ask a question. And so we were going through this real period of flux. Business was not as we had typically known it. In that year, when we learned about all the problems, most of the governance focus was on making sure that we could continue to raise money for the institution and for all of us to be positive ambassadors and to really focus on effective PR. At the end of year one, we had already begun to see results. So while none of us felt that we were out of the woods, there was, within 8 or 9 months' time, we really felt that we were making progress. And I think that was key to keeping the positive momentum going forward. 2003 was when, as Ed mentioned, when we instituted this new governance. We went to a system of 25 trustees, 65 overseers, and a new group called our Magellan Society, which was a group of trustees who had been involved for many years, who, as trustees, who were anxious to move to more of an honorary role in our governance structure, although they continue to remain very active in the governance. There were many questions during that time, but I think that it was an opportunity. That was when our governance was taking shape, and everybody was really finding their way in this new governance structure. Some of the questions that came up: are the trustees, our new group of 25, up to the task of higher expectations? We had higher financial expectations from those individuals. Meanwhile, we had overseers who had been accustomed to the role of trustee, who we had now moved into a slightly different role. We were still continuing to rely on them for financial support, but much of their role was much more as ambassadors for the institution. So everybody was figuring out where their new place in the structure was. 2004, I think, is when we really learned that we could begin to look to the future. Everyone was becoming more comfortable with this new governance structure. We have certainly learned, and I, as chair of the Board of Overseers, have learned one size does not fit all. And I have to tell you, I have spent an inordinate amount of time communicating with overseers. And it would be easy for me to sit here today and say we have 4 meetings a year and everybody shows up, and when we ask people to give to the annual fund, we get 100% participation. That is obviously our goal. It doesn't happen that easily. I spend a lot of time emailing, writing people, reaching out, because I think that the whole structure of governance is changing dramatically. I'll just end with 2 sections. I'd like to just explain a little bit about how our structure works. This group of overseers of 60 individuals, we meet 3 to 4 times annually as a group, and then on 1 to 2 other occasions, we meet as a full board with the trustees and the Magellan Society. At each overseer meeting, we have a State of the Aquarium update, presentation by one of our departments so that our overseers really feel a part of what's going on at the institution. And thirdly, a piece that I think has been very critical for engagement, we have breakout sessions where we try to do the type of generative thinking that Bill talks about, and hopefully we'll be able to do more of that. I think it's very important. At each meeting that we have, we spend 10 to 15 minutes just letting people have the opportunity to visit one another. I am a big believer that in governance, it is much easier to work effectively as a group if you know the individuals who you are working with. And I know we're always anxious to come into a session and get going with the agenda because it's a full agenda. But I do believe that time that we allow for one another to know each other individually really helps us work more productively as a group. I would end by saying that we are very hopeful about what faces us at the New England Aquarium. Our new governance structure seems to be working very well. We will dearly miss Ed Toomey as he steps down early in 2005. We look forward to welcoming a dynamic new CEO early in 2005. And we will continue. I think one of our biggest issues going forward is the engagement of our trustees. And we continue to work on that, to reach out to people, and to quote Bill's book, to begin to get more playfulness back in the discussions that we have. We had gotten away from that for obvious reasons, and I look forward to much more fun and playfulness and good work in the coming months.
Thank you all. We look forward to being able to engage with you and some questions as well. Let's hear about Bird Street Community Center and how you manage your challenges. Marielle?
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? I'm going to talk about basically a little bit of the history of Bird Street, what our board was like before, and then the external factors that really forced the board to look at itself, how it needed to change. Then I'll turn it over to Kaidi, who will sort of give you more in-depth perspective about the actual struggles and challenges that the board took on trying to undergo that change. And then I'd like to take it back, since I like to have the last word, and sort of give you our key learnings from that. Bird Street Community Center has served the Upham's Corner community in Dorchester for 26 years. It was founded in 1978 by a group of residents who were concerned about the fact that there was no youth center, no community center, no place for especially the kids in the area to come together and have a safe place to play and not be on the street. For over a decade, it was primarily volunteer run. And it had a very small budget. Up until 1990, the budget was only $90,000. In the late 80s, early 90s, the board decided to grow the organization to address the community needs and also to capture some economies of scale and make the organization more sustainable. And in 10 years, it grew to a $1.1 million organization. In 1998, we reached capacity in our facility, an 8,000 square foot facility in a municipal building. And so the board decided that we needed a new facility and undertook an $11 million capital campaign to build a new facility that we expand into, which would result in an annual budget of $2.36 million. Huge, huge challenge there. In addition to this capital campaign and being at capacity, we hit the economic difficulties that everyone faced. And so for the first time in many, many years, Bird Street had difficulty in meeting its budget. And had to face layoffs for the first time. Additionally, our capital campaign stalled because the board hadn't realized that it would be hard to get funders and other volunteers to step on when we didn't have a large individual donor support base already and we didn't have a name board. Basically, people thought, that's a great idea, that's going to make a tremendous change in the community. Come to us when you're further along and we know you can succeed. This board was also very used to focusing on programming. I succeeded an executive director who'd been there for 12 years and had basically taken on the leadership in the growth of the organization and finding its funding, and the board was used to just providing the support that she needed and sort of following her ideas and priorities. And the board didn't like to focus on anything other than sort of the programmatic aspects. It was, unlike the aquarium, is way too small a board. We had at that time, I think, it's a 21-seat board at the time, and we had 15 members, and only about 9 or 10 of them were active. Nothing was done to sort of address that. And additionally, this board was used to making decisions by consensus. So they would take a vote, and it might be majority, but things would be revisited over and over again until consensus was reached. Additionally, it was a very, very long-standing board. We had a couple of board members who'd been there for over 20 years. They were the original founders. I think the average term for the board members at that time was about 10 years. And so they'd become used to the way things had been. I was brought on in February 2001 to lead the capital campaign, to come up with new systems and set up the organization for its growth. And the board had really put a lot of thought and time into planning the programs and how we would address the needs of the community, but really did not think that the organization itself needed to change. It was completely focused on programs and how the programs needed to change, but not how the organization itself would affect the organization and how that would affect the board. And then I think the final change there was the fact that both the growth of our operating budget as well as this challenging capital campaign was putting us under a lot more financial scrutiny. And so we needed a board that had the financial expertise and interest to really provide oversight and not just sort of, when the auditor came in, sort of glaze over until he was done and then vote to approve the audit. So those were the external factors that we were facing at that time. Kaidi?
Hello. Could you hear me? I began on the board January of 2000 and had been a board member, I guess, It's going to be 5 years. As Marielle was saying, we are engaged in our $11 million capital campaign. The space, we need a really big building. I think it's 5,000 kids we're trying to serve with the new building. And definitely 8,000 square feet wasn't enough. So beginning of 2004, I became president in November 2003. Beginning of 2004, the board realized that we needed to do some restructuring. And so we hired a consultant to help with board development and restructuring. And what we wanted to do was move from being consensus-driven to more task committee-driven in terms of making decisions. We had a problem with we'd make a decision, then 2 or 3 months later we'd come back and revisit that decision. Board members would change their minds, said, well, we shouldn't be doing it like this. There was no efficient way to make decisions and stick with it. So we had, I want to say, 3 workshops on board structure and board development. We set up committees and task forces to deal with certain areas that we wanted to concentrate on. And fundraising and capital campaign was one of the biggest focus. I think, I'm trying to think of the timeline here. I want to say maybe late summer, things came to a head in which the board had approved, let's say, 3 different projects for the capital campaign, and none of them were being accomplished. The last one, I believe, was in August. I had reached out to the board and said, we have to start on this project for the capital campaign. This was the 3rd project, and I had hoped that we would get board participation in accomplishing this project. I knew it was summer, people were away, that sort of thing, but come September, I still hadn't heard from my board. And needless to say, I was quite upset. I decided that, well, with the consultant, that this board did not want to fundraise. And you really do need your board to be involved in fundraising, especially for an $11 million capital campaign. And it was made clear to me that that wasn't going to happen. So with the consultant, I sent out a letter asking the board to resign as a whole and step onto a community advisory committee. Well, I heard back from them. And boy, did I ever. They were upset. They said, what's going on? I said, all summer, we started with these capital campaign projects, I believe in March. I said, none of you have stepped up to the plate to make sure that we get these projects done. I haven't heard from some of you. Some of you haven't been attending, meetings. Now that, I ask you to step down for the good of Bird Street, there's a problem. Especially, some of these board members were totally inactive. So I got a lot of calls. They thought that I was trying to, along with Marielle, I guess, take away that community feel to Bird Street. And that wasn't the case. I really felt that we needed people with different skill sets that was committed to fundraising and building a stronger Bird Street. And even though I appreciated that the board members were really interested in programming and making sure that, our programs were strong to attract kids to those programs, I don't think they realize that we really need the space, that we cannot serve 5,000 kids in this community in the space. So we had a meeting. Board members, expressed that they didn't like what was going on. I made it clear that I don't think I could go on with this board. And the majority of people understood and stepped off. The others said, well, since the majority is stepping off, they will step off also. So right now we're in the midst of recruiting a new board. And hopefully this board would be committed to the capital campaign. At that meeting, many board members admitted that they did not want to do fundraising. And that's just unacceptable. I mean, the goal here is to really provide quality services to underprivileged kids and families. So I saw it as there was just a situation that needed to be resolved. So hopefully with this new board, I think we have 11 people now. We have a diversity of skills. Some are from the financial community, some are from law. We have a social worker. Some are from the community at large, parents who send their kids there. So hopefully with this board, and they do understand, as I told them, that fundraising is key right now, that we would, achieve our goal.
Just to summarize, we restructured the board, or the way we wanted the board to operate, without the intention of replacing the entire board. We knew we needed a more flexible a more flexible board that could respond to the changes and could provide the support we needed now and in the future. And what was happening is that the current board members did not, although they agreed to those changes, did not want to take on the new responsibilities. So one of the key learnings is the fact that we focused on the purpose of the organization and the priorities that the board had set, and not sort of the problems we were running into, and really tried to problem solve on how that would happen. And in that way, through that process, the board really realized that what they needed were to engage not in programs but in governance. Once that became clear as to what those duties entailed, most of the board members realized they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to fundraise. They didn't want to sit on a financial committee. They didn't want to do strategic planning. They'd much rather focus on programming, and that's why we created sort of community advisory committee, which would focus on that, and they could step onto that. Another key learning was that the consultant, David Wright, was incredibly helpful. We wouldn't have succeeded without him because it gave us a neutral person and an objective observer to help us facilitate this. And then I think the final thing is the fact that we never said that the board previously was unwanted or wrong. What we focused on was the fact that the skills needed on the organization had changed, and did they want to perform those duties? So when that question kept on coming up, do you really want to do what is required of a board member now? The answer would come out repeatedly no. And that's why we ended up asking for the full resignation, because they couldn't ask for individual people to step off. So we figured we'd clear the board. The consultant and I invited the former board members to come back on who had the skills that we needed at that time. We asked Heidi to continue to give us a little bit of consistency, and have been recruiting for a more diverse board than we had previously.
Thank you all. I'm going to ask Bill or Ron if you can join us for the Q&A to either ask questions of the panelists and also questions you may have. And can you hear me? I'm going to ask, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Oh, now it's working, now that I screamed. Okay. We only have 15 minutes for questions, and I know you have a lot that you want to ask. I would like to begin with one. Clearly, these were two organizations that had a board restructuring because they were in a moment of crisis, however you define what, the crisis at different levels. And I heard each talk about kind of, to some extent, how you manage the existing board. I mean, it seems as if you each found a way to keep the existing board engaged, to help them understand the crisis, help them kind of determine whether they were up to the task of being part of the crisis. And I think that's brilliant, and I applaud you for it. I am curious, though, and not just in context of where you are. You think about boards as being kind of a dynamic process. If we're going to be fiduciary stewards, if we're going to provide strategic direction, if we're going to be part of kind of a paradigm shift, how did you go about kind of looking at and recruiting new board members that are diverse by every definition of the word, because you can't be a brain trust and you can't operate at that level if you don't have diversity? And yet I looked at the Bridgestar report that's in your package, and most boards recruit from their own existing network, which would suggest in many cases that it may not bring all of those perspectives. So I'd like to kind of hear a two-part description, kind of how you thought about it in terms of what you needed, and then how you went about recruiting the new board members. And
our first task was to use the people that we had, and as you see, as I said briefly, to make the kind of decisions that we had to make with 125 people was just too difficult. And I summarized that by saying, rather than giving really effective dynamic information, we were managing information. So you got kind of summary statements from people, and it was difficult for people to come back and be a full partner. So the first thing to do was to manage the number, but number isn't the only issue. It then became a matter of the quality of the conversation and responsibilities on both sides with the information that was at hand. So we made simply internal political decisions about who the best people among those that we had were to be members of the new board. So we didn't go outside and look for new members. We said, who have we got now that we can use to face these issues with the right kind of information and reach joint decisions? At the same time, we set up, as part of our new committee structure, a nominating committee, very actively involved, to talk about the future of current members and to engage new members. So we go out and we develop the prospects. We have long lists of people that come in. We involve them in committees. We involve them in the overseers group and move them up to trustees. So it was really both, because we acknowledged that our future demands many of the people that we have, but some other people too. So there were so many things that were going on in parallel. No issue was ever faced and solved, and they say, now let's move on to the next issue. Everything was happening at the same time. It's like an algebraic equation with many too many unknown quantities. But that's the name of the game. I think Bill spoke exactly to that. That's what's happening. That's how dynamic the organizations are. So we did both.
Could I just add, too, that we are very fluid. We have trustees who, after a term, may move to overseer, and similarly, we have overseers who move to trustees. So we do encourage that fluidity within our organization.
What we did first, as far as trying to figure out what skills we needed, was to take a look at the tasks coming up before us and how we wanted to run the organization, and so what skills that would require. And that gave us sort of a blueprint of the sort of board that we would then need. We then tried to recruit from outside of our network, because you're right, most of it comes from who do you know immediately over there and who does your board know. A primary source right now for our current board is the Rotary Club, the Boston and the Wellesley Rotary Club. I'm a member there. My resource development director is a member as well. And so we would talk about Bird Street and talk about our needs, and people who were interested would come to us, and we were able to recruit, I think, 5 members from 2 different clubs. Additionally, the United Way, the board bank there, and then Bridgestar's board source are other sources that we're looking at to recruit board members. Another plan is that our committees will be entry points for people to come and learn about the organization and work on particular tasks. And we hope from there to develop and recruit leaders from the committees, rather than going to people and asking them to make the huge commitment of becoming a board member right away.
Questions from the audience?
Hi. My question is, I guess, starting with Bill, but I'm interested in thoughts from the panel. In the book, The New Work of the Nonprofit Board, which is in many ways the antecedent to governance as leadership, you talk about the authors, who are your colleagues, talk about the notion of the primary responsibility of the board being to understand what matters and to organize around what matters. And in many ways, I think this concept of generative leadership is a more specific extension of that idea. And I think that the challenge for these boards, and you hear it in some ways in between the lines of these two case studies, is it's not just a power balance issue between the executive and the governing group. It's in many ways a time balance. And I wonder how, in this world where the amount of time that we have as volunteers to spend on any volunteer activity, how board members can actually be helpful in the, I say as a CEO of a nonprofit, if I get 2 hours of quality bandwidth out of a board member in a month, I'm in gravy. And so, the question is, how do you do that with a board? In other words, how do we actually live these principles in running boards today?
I'll try. Speaking of time, I'll just try to give a very brief answer. We can get a real life version of it. A couple of thoughts. One of our thoughts would be to always pay attention to the fact that we have recruited boards to do many, many, many different types of things. To be our fundraisers, to be kind of a Noah's Ark of experts in all different types of areas, to help us with our legitimacy, community outreach, and not necessarily for governing. And so part of what I'm intrigued with in this panel discussion is that people have discovered that and said, okay, you know what, to help us do that, you don't need to be on the board. So I would be looking at offloading some of the functions now in the board and handling them ad hoc or in other committees, in overseers, advisory committees, and the like. Secondly, in terms of the kind of competition for time with trustees, the wager we're making is that more important, more consequential, more meaningful work will attract and sustain the energy of trustees. That the time people are most unwilling to give is the time spent in routine, bureaucratic, unrewarding types of governance, and that the closer people get to the real work, the more time they'll make available. So fewer functions, more time on real stuff, and I think maybe we need a tectonic shift. Fewer people running around on dozen boards contributing a little bit of this and that, more people focused where they can make that type of difference. But you're right, the time challenge, it's very significant.
Ed, you want to respond? Then there's a question in the back.
Quickly, one of the things you have to do is just spend time. When we went into this, initially into the restructuring, in addition to regular meetings, I had a conference call with members of our executive committee, 9 of them, every Friday morning. And so I talked and I talked and I talked, and they talked back. So it was simply spending more time, especially in a transition period. The other side of it, there's some Sarbanes-Oxley lessons we learn here, apart from some of the provisions that are in it. But one of the things they talk about on the part of governors is the duty to know, but on the part of managers is the duty to tell. And so that if you're going to be as effective as you want to be, you have to get the right kind of information. And so strategic communications and being out there with the whole story as you know it. And if you tell people that this is the story as I know it, you don't get held for downs later on when you didn't know the whole story, because who does? And so I think communication is very, very important. Some of it is just practical, different ways to do it in different times. But the understanding of responsibilities, the duty to know must be matched by the duty to tell on the part of whoever is the manager at that time, meaning the whole process. And both of those, from my point of view, going back to one of my original comments, is governance. It isn't simply a matter of 10 or 12 or 25 or 125 people taking a vote. Governance is the process of decision-making with various levels of responsibility.
I think the operative word in what he said was strategic communication. It's not inundating directors with everything. It's informing them about the critical issues in the organization. Yeah.
Just to bring this down from 50,000 feet, that point that this executive director raised is absolutely critical. As a board member, we don't want to hear about the good things. We want to hear about the problems. And we want to be involved in coming up with creative suggestions and ideas for solving the problems. And if executive directors would address those to us rather than the dog and pony shows of what is good, it would be very useful to us.
Well stated. Question?
I would like to ask Mary, how In other words, you've told us that your it's not an advisory board. Board of Overseers meets maybe 4 times a year. Does the Board of Trustees meet more, and do they have the ultimate authority, or how does that work?
I think the key difference is that the fiduciary responsibility is with the Board of Trustees. And one of the main focuses of our governance restructuring was to create a Board of Trustees that was smaller so that it would be easier to meet on a regular basis. And they have typically met 4 to 6 times a year. We have a new Board of Trustees chair who was just elected in November, and I know his strategy going forward is to have trustee meetings 4 times a year and to gather for a longer time frame of 4 to 6 hours, because he really believes that that's when you not only get to know one another, but you can really get into the meat of the issues. The Board of Overseers is also kept apprised of all of the fiduciary issues, but on a smaller scale, if you will, on more of a top line. And as I said, we're still a little bit of a work in progress. And one of the problems we face is engaging individuals as overseers who think that they're a little bit off the hook. And I've had people say to me, well, when I was a trustee, I took this a little bit more seriously, and now I feel that I don't have to attend as many meetings, and what we're really working to do is make sure that everybody feels that they're accountable in their particular role.
Question? And this will be the last question. Yeah.
How does a subgroup of a board initiate innovative governance at a time of organizational equanimity? Another way to say, how do you shock a board out of complacency when it's not in crisis?
Okay, Marielle has a response.
Well, I think every nonprofit faces some issue which can be presented as a crisis. And that's what I would suggest. I think the most effective way to shock a board is to, if you have to, create a crisis. Because otherwise you're presenting situations and it doesn't get the attention. And I think this was also a suggestion in the book Guts as far as what make really good companies. And just present whether it's something about staffing or turnover or changing trends, and have the board sort of problem solve along those lines.
I think you can do it without creating a crisis if you engage the directors in a meaningful way in kind of understanding the potential that lies ahead and getting them involved in thinking creatively about how you can really maximize the organization. I think kind of an underpinning of everything that Bill said, in addition to those things we know we're responsible for, is that board members want to be a part of making a difference. That's why they're part of the organization in the first place. And so if you create a venue in which they can be engaged that way, I don't think you have to be in a crisis in order to create that kind of energy, that kind of positive energy that builds positive results.
Could I just add a 30-second tip, which would be to, my advice would be to, as an alternative to creating a crisis, which I think will work, take away all the props. Take away the structure, the agenda that kind of lulls board into kind of going down a checklist. Get the board together with a blank page and ask some really big, scary questions like, what's important? What are we proud of? What are we really worried about? And that will begin to surface a lot of the thinking that kind of lies at the root of innovation and the type of change that our colleagues here have led.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the panel. I know we didn't have a lot of Q&A time, but it was such a rich discussion. Gita, you put together a wonderful program, and I turn it over to Ira to close it out.
Thank you. Thank you. We did have an agenda, perhaps too ambitious an agenda, but I think we're focusing on the intriguing, nagging, looming issues of governance. And that's our ambition, that's our presumption, that's our dream at the Boston Foundation, is that we convene, that this be a crossroads. We hope that You'll use this as a switching mechanism to be in touch with talent, resources, use Gita. And we'll be, for our part, meeting tomorrow in a half-day board meeting and trying to practice what the panel and others have been teaching us. So our thanks again to Bill, to Marielle, to Kaidi, to Ed, to Mary, to Benny, and to all of you for coming. Thanks so much.